The page was already waiting for me when I turned the corner. I smelled hot metal first, that dry, coppery tang you get from wiring under too much load, except the hallway lights were dim and the station was supposed to be on partial emergency power. Under my boots, the floor gave off that constant low hum I'd been trying to ignore since I arrived, a buried vibration steady and mechanical, as if something huge was operating far below the ice. My throat felt scraped raw from the air. Every breath in that place tasted filtered, stripped, used too many times. The paper had been pinned flat to the wall beside the operations room. Not taped there, not clipped up, pinned, centered with a neatness that made my stomach tighten. It was my personnel file, or close enough to one that my body recognized it before my mind did. My photo was correct, and my employee number was correct, but my name wasn't. The letters had been swapped, subtly, intelligently, like a hand learning my name by sound instead of sight. Grant Hollis Wainwright had become Garnt Hollis Wainwright. Beneath it, in the same clean font the station used for system notices, one line sat by itself. Discrepancy identified. Correction in progress. I heard Owen Rusk's voice from the empty hallway behind me, calm as a training recording. "Do you remember what you changed?" I froze with my hand halfway to the page. The skin across my shoulders went cold. Owen had been dead for 5 years. I knew exactly how his voice should have sounded because I'd listened to it for weeks after the collapse, in safety reviews, in deposition prep, and in the clipped fragments the company lawyers used when they needed to fix the sequence of events into something survivable. I looked back. No one was there. When I turned to the wall again, the page updated before I touched it. One letter slid into place, another moved out, as if it had been waiting to see which version of me had reached for it. It started 4 days earlier, with a charter flight over a white flat world and a shutdown packet signed by a man who wasn't there to meet me. The post sat on the northern edge of the National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska, a low spread of connected modules half buried in wind-packed drifts, all of it painted in the same government white that vanished against the sky. From the air it looked temporary, something set down for a season and forgotten. Up close it had the opposite feel, and it looked less like a facility than a thing that had settled into the ground over years and decided not to leave. My orders were simple on paper. Validate final decommissioning status, confirm that all atmospheric monitoring systems were offline. Review environmental storage compliance, sign the closure package, and get back on the next weather window. The previous research lead, Coulter Ames Duval, had filed the last active handover 3 weeks before I arrived. His memo was thin, too thin. Facility and controlled shutdown. No on-site hazards beyond listed cold weather protocols. Recommend expedited final audit due to intermittent system wake events. That phrase bothered me before I ever landed. System wake events wasn't technical language. It was a placeholder phrase, in the kind people used when they didn't want to commit to the thing they meant. Still, I was there because I knew how to sort places like that. That had been my reputation for years. I was the man they sent when a remote station had to be wrapped, reconciled, and signed cleanly enough that no one at headquarters ever had to think about it again. I knew Arctic infrastructure. I knew the rhythms of isolated facilities, the quirks in old environmental systems, the way moisture got into panels and turned diagnostics into superstition. And though I didn't like thinking about it in those terms, I'd certified that site before. Not its final shutdown, but earlier stability reviews years back, when it was still one station in a string of Arctic installations the company was trying to keep alive on reduced budgets and optimistic paperwork. And I knew the code family. I knew the reporting language. I knew the assumptions built into every form. That familiarity should have made the place easier to read. Instead, it made the first 10 minutes worse. The pilot cut engines and the silence lasted maybe 2 seconds before the station answered with its own sound. that low subterranean hum coming up through the packed snow and landing struts. Not loud, just present. A vibration more than a sound. When I stepped down onto the hard drift beside the landing pad, I felt it through the soles of my boots before I heard it in my ears. Inside, the air was warm enough to keep pipes from freezing, but too dry for comfort. The back of my throat tightened almost immediately. The whole corridor smelled faintly metallic, like a rack room after an electrical surge. Even the overhead lights didn't stay fully on. They rose in strips as I moved beneath them, then dimmed behind me in stages. No one met me at intake. No one answered my first 3 calls on internal comms. The station directory still showed 5 assigned roles, but only 2 status indicators were lit. Mine and one for field technician Maribel Inez Quintero. Colter Duval's name sat in the roster without a live marker, not crossed out, not archived, just present in that unsettling bureaucratic middle state where a system hadn't accepted an absence yet. I signed into the operations module and stopped. The rules were on the wall, not posted, not laminated, not printed out and taped beside the main console the way field procedures usually were. They were integrated into the wall panel itself, black type beneath a sealed clear finish, as if the material had been manufactured around the words. All personnel must verify their identity against station records at the beginning of each shift. Discrepancies between memory and documentation must be reported immediately. Do not alter any written record without authorization from the system. If a record updates without input, step away and wait for reclassification to complete. Do not respond to voices originating from archived personnel files. I read them twice, then a third time. At that point, I still treated them like legacy compliance language, the kind a nervous supervisor pushed through after a software migration or a contamination incident. I remember actually nodding to myself like I'd solved something. I told myself Duval had probably inherited a bad records package and overcorrected with procedural theater, and that was the last easy explanation I had. The operations console was running in partial mode. Half the station should have been dark, but power maps showed intermittent activity in archive storage, communications, and one of the old atmospheric modeling racks. When I pulled the last 7 days of system logs, I found entries time-stamped within the current shift window. Routine machine events, air exchange cycles, printer activity, user authentication requests, audio archive access. All of it impossible if the place had truly been sitting dormant between scheduled maintenance visits. I checked the obvious causes first: timer faults, backup task loops, a desynced internal clock. Nothing elegant presented itself. The time server matched satellite sync within normal drift, no incoming remote commands, and no scheduled jobs consistent with what I was seeing. The printer in the records alcove clicked once, just once, a dry little sound in the quiet. I turned toward it and waited, but nothing printed. Only the hum in the floor. Only that faint hot metal smell growing stronger when I stood still long enough to notice it. I opened Duval's last inspection bundle and found one more note buried at the back, handwritten across the margin of a maintenance checklist in blue block letters. It was the only thing in his file that looked human. If the records disagree with each other, keep the oldest copy. No explanation, no signature beyond his initials. I slid that sheet into my folder without really knowing why. Later, I would have given a great deal to know when he'd written it and which version of him had. My first formal task was identity verification, which would have been laughably routine anywhere else. I remember setting my case on the operations desk, flexing feeling back into my fingers, and deciding I might as well clear the wall procedure before I started hunting phantom logs. A place like that ran on boring steps. You respected the sequence, and the sequence respected you back. I entered my credentials into the main console. The keyboard was warm, warmer than it should have been in a room that size. The screen thought for a moment, then returned my personnel profile. At a glance, everything looked fine. My photograph, current clearance level, assignment order, travel authorization. Then I saw the name line. Garnt Hollis Wainwright. A yellow status tab sat beside it. Pending correction. I frowned, backed out, and ran the verification again. Same result. Same 2 transposed letters. Same yellow tab. I checked the local badge reader and got the identical error, not a variation, the exact same misspelling repeated with the precision of a system pulling from a single authoritative source. That should have reassured me. Consistency usually meant the problem lived in one place. A corrupt name field. An old replication error. Annoying but ordinary. I told myself that anyway. I opened the station personnel roster. Garnt. I pulled the transport manifest attached to my arrival packet. Garnt. I checked the emergency contact printout and medical records. Garnt again, even though I knew perfectly well no one on those systems should have had reason to touch that file in months. I was still calm then, mostly. What unsettled me wasn't the typo itself, and it was how deliberate it felt. Anyone who'd ever worked around old software knew random corruption. Missing characters, garbage strings, duplicated fields. This wasn't that. This was a neat, repeatable wrongness. A version of my name that looked like it had been typed by someone listening through a wall. I printed a local verification copy, expecting to force the system to commit the error in one physical form I could annotate and move on from. The printer in the alcove spun up with an eager mechanical whine. The page came out warm, smelling of toner and that same metallic heat. Garnt Hollis Wainwright. Pending correction. I stared at it for longer than I should have. The rational thing by the wall rule was to report the discrepancy immediately. But reporting it to whom exactly? Maribel still hadn't answered my direct pings, and Duval was absent. Headquarters would tell me to restart the local record service and submit a ticket. I already knew that script. I could have written it for them. Instead, I opened a manual audit note and logged the anomaly as probable database decay. I remember the exact sentence because later the station handed it back to me. Identity mismatch appears systematic across active local records. Most likely low-priority replication fault in decommissioned personnel schema. No action required pending full archive extraction. That was the kind of sentence I had built a career on. Calm, plausible, final sounding. It made problems smaller while pretending to define them. I had used language like that before in places colder and more dangerous than that station. Too often, if I'm honest. And there are sentences that don't feel like lies when you write them because what they really are is a bridge. A way to get from what you know to what you need the page to say. I set the printed verification copy beside my folder and kept working. 10 minutes later, I found the same misspelling on every active system in the building. Not most systems, every system. Environmental controls, supply inventory, internal comms, maintenance scheduling. Even an obsolete visitor log that shouldn't have been writable under current permissions. Every instance used the same wrong letters in the same positions as if one correction had propagated out through the station while I was walking room to room. I stood in the communications bay with the old headset hanging cold against my neck and listened to the ducting breathe. And that was the first moment I understood I was being answered. I just didn't know by what. Looking back, that was the moment I should have reported everything and left on the first weather call, even if it meant sleeping on the pad in a survival bag until the plane came back. But professional habits are hard to kill. Mine had been rewarded too often. If a system behaved strangely, I isolated it. If paperwork went bad, I reconciled it. If a station looked unstable, I made it legible. 5 years earlier, I had done exactly that to a tower that should have been shut down. I hadn't admitted that to myself in plain language yet. Not there. Not then, but part of me already knew why my throat had gone so dry. The archive room sat behind a heavy insulated door off the main lab corridor. It should have been cold storage for hard copy logs, old atmospheric models, dead media, all the records the company never wanted to throw away but didn't want to pay to index properly either. When I opened it, the metallic smell intensified so sharply it felt like I had bitten foil. The hum under the floor deepened too, not louder, just closer, as if the room rested directly above whatever mechanism had been speaking through the station all day. Shelves lined 3 walls, labeled cases, audio cartridges, portable drives, paper boxes with year tabs faded pale by fluorescent light. A terminal in the corner had woken itself. The screen showed recent archive activity. One item sat open. Rusk, Owen, field audio logs. My hand stopped moving for a second. Owen Rusk had been a junior technician on the Sable Ridge monitoring tower collapse 5 years earlier. 26 years old. Good in the field, careful with instruments. The kind of tech supervisors called fussy right up until the moment one of them needed to prove a detail had been observed correctly. He'd submitted 3 condition notes the week before the collapse. I knew because I'd read them before I rewrote the summary that went up the chain. The station wasn't just surfacing an old file, it was surfacing the file. I told myself it was a coincidence of archive indexing, cross-station pull, shared corporate records family. My assignment credentials probably had broader retrieval access than local staff. The explanation was flimsy and I knew it, but I still took it. I clicked the first available entry. The timestamp read current day, current hour. That was impossible. Owen had been dead for years. Undead before that station had even been placed on decommissioning status. The speaker crackled once. Then I heard his voice. Not theatrical, not distorted, not a ghost story voice. Just Owen, a little dry, a little nasal with the flat patience he used when he was trying not to sound annoyed with management. Field note, tower base review, west side anchor set, wind loading outside modeled variants, base anchor 3 showing lateral walk with gust response. I closed my eyes without meaning to. I could see him in the safety vest with the neck zipper half down, recorder clipped to his chest, trying to make clean observations in weather that made pencils brittle. The log continued. Recommended action: suspend operation pending structural review. Repeat. Suspend operation pending structural review. Then after a pause, his tone changed. Not dramatically, just enough that my skin tightened across my arms. Revision received. Continued operation authorized pending seasonal reinforcement. No immediate risk to personnel under forecasted lateral load. Those weren't Owen's words. They were mine. Not exactly as I had first written them, but close enough that my stomach dropped hard and clean inside me. Continued operation authorized pending seasonal reinforcement. No immediate risk to personnel under forecasted lateral load. I had inserted those lines into the final structural summary after removing Owen's recommendation for shutdown. I had polished them for tone, smoothed them until they sounded like the kind of caution executives could live with. On the playback, Owen spoke them in his own voice. Then he said my name. Grant, if you're reviewing this archive, compare the version you filed to the version you changed. I hit stop so fast I nearly snapped the key. The room went very quiet except for the vent hiss and the printer somewhere down the hall feeding itself paper. My mouth had gone dry enough that swallowing hurt. I checked the file metadata with hands that were still steady, which is a detail that matters to me now. I didn't lose control. Not then. I did what I always did. I examined the system. The timestamp was wrong in a way I couldn't map cleanly. The file showed present access creation, not just present access. It wasn't marked copied. It wasn't marked restored. The system was treating the log as new. I opened the second entry. Again, current timestamp. Again, Owen. Summary language amended at supervisory level. It observed fracture propagation remained within expected winter tolerance. Another line I had changed. Another sentence I had built to sound less like danger and more like inconvenience. I could smell hot circuitry so strongly by then that I checked the outlet bank under the terminal for a short. Nothing. No visible overheating. No heat bloom on the wall panel. Just that impossible scent growing stronger whenever an active log played. Then the recording said conversationally, "You always like to move the risk down a line." I didn't hit stop that time. I yanked the power cable from the terminal. The screen stayed on. Not bright, not fully live, but on. Static scratched through the speaker, then Owen again, very soft. I wrote it down because I thought that was what the writing was for. I stepped back so fast my calf hit a storage case and sent it skidding. For the first time since landing, I looked at the wall rule about archived personnel voices and felt what it meant instead of just reading it. Do not respond to voices originating from archived personnel files, not because they weren't real, because they were. The printer in the hall clicked 3 times in quick succession. I left the archive room with the smell of hot metal clinging in my nose and Owen's last line pinned in my head like a splinter. I took one of the hard copy index binders with me without signing it out. When I flipped through it at the next workstation, the page tabs rasped against my fingertips, dry as old bone. Half the entries were ordinary, half weren't. Some logs existed in print only and not in digital records. Some had dates that hadn't happened yet. One page showed a maintenance form filed by Coulter Duval 2 days in the future, in handwriting I didn't recognize, reporting unstable archive behavior and recommending all record comparisons be suspended. At the bottom of that page, in fresh black type, the system had added a notation, source, confidence, under review. I know now what that smell meant. I didn't then. It followed active logs the way ozone follows a lightning strike, a warning that something invisible had already passed through the room. Maribel called me before I decided whether to go back into archive storage. The first thing I heard wasn't her voice. It was the open line itself, a faint wash of static and air movement, and the soft, hollow sound of a larger room than the one I was in. Then she said my name, or close to it. Grant. She left just enough hesitation before the last consonant that I couldn't tell if she'd read it off a corrupted screen or if she was testing which version I'd answer to. "This is Wainwright," I said, because formality was easier than anything else. "Field audit. I need your status and location." She gave a short breath that might have been a laugh if there'd been any warmth in it. "No, you need to stay where the records already have you." Her voice was younger than I'd expected from the personnel file, but tired in a way that flattened it. Not frightened. More like someone working around a machine that never fully stopped making noise. "I'm in the East Utility Wing," she said. At least that's where my last intact access log put me." "Why haven't you responded to pages?" "I have. Depends which set you got." I nearly told her to stop playing games, but there was something in the background on her end, a rhythmic metal tick like a relay trying to engage that kept me listening. I gave her the short version. Arrival completed, partial power across multiple modules. Unauthorized activity in archives. Identity verification returning a persistent name error. When I said the misspelling out loud, she didn't ask me to repeat it. "Is it the same across all active systems?" she asked. "Or does it vary by terminal?" "The same." That was the wrong answer. I knew it from the silence that followed. "Then don't keep checking," she said. "If it settles on one wrong version, it's choosing a track." I leaned against the operations desk and looked at Duval's note where I'd placed it beside the keyboard. "Keep the oldest copy." You're going to need to be more specific than that. She exhaled slowly. The station rewrites data to maintain internal consistency. That's the simple version. If two records conflict, it doesn't preserve uncertainty, it resolves it by changing the bad record. Sometimes, she said, sometimes by changing the one that's easier. A vent came on above me with a dusty rush. My throat tightened again. You're telling me the system is autonomously editing official documentation. I'm telling you not to trust anything just because it's newer. I asked where Duval was. She took too long to answer. He kept trying to reconcile versions. He thought if he could find the first bad change, everything after would fall back into place. Then his records stopped agreeing on whether he'd left. Is he in the station? I don't know, she said, and I believed that she meant it literally. I asked her to meet in operations. We could compare hard copies, isolate the live record service, run a clean extraction from cold storage. That was still the shape my mind wanted the problem to have, a technical problem with procedure on the other side. No. The refusal came fast enough to sound rehearsed. Why not? Because synchronization happens when we occupy the same space, the line hissed. Somewhere on her side, something heavy scraped across a floor. I waited for the explanation that didn't come. Maribel. Listen to me, she said, sharper now. If a document updates in front of you, step away. Don't touch it. Don't annotate it. And don't try to fix it while it's moving. And if you hear a voice from archive, don't answer. It gets stronger when you answer. I almost told her I already had, except I hadn't. Not technically. I had listened. There was a difference I still wanted credit for. Why are you still there? I asked instead. This time her silence carried feeling in it. Not fear, weariness maybe, or shame. Same reason anybody stays in a place too long, she said. I thought I could sort out what had actually happened before it sorted me. Then very quietly, you signed off on some of these station families, didn't you? It wasn't an accusation. That would have been easier. Years ago. I thought so, she said. Your syntax is in the old stability language. The room felt smaller around me. What does that mean? It means when the updates start, they sound like you. The line crackled hard enough that I pulled the handset away from my ear. When I brought it back, she was already speaking again, as if her side of the conversation had continued without me. Keep one physical copy of anything that matters. Oldest version if you have a choice. If you find my maintenance notebook, don't compare it to the printed service record. And if the station asks you to verify memory against documentation, don't do it twice. Maribel. What? Why are you helping me? Another pause. Then in a tone so neutral it took effort to hear the human thing inside it, she said, because I know what it sounds like when a system decides a person is the easiest place to put the fault. The line went dead before I could ask what she meant, and I sat with the receiver in my hand listening to empty carrier noise until even that dropped away. Then I replaced it carefully and looked around the operations room as if the walls might have shifted while I was on the call. At the time, I told myself Maribel was isolated, sleep-deprived, probably halfway to environmental stress psychosis in a failing station with no reliable clock discipline. That explanation fit more cleanly than the alternatives. It also let me keep working. I printed local copies of the personnel roster, active system log, and my verification record. I started building a paper chain, oldest copy on the left, fresh output on the right. I wrote timestamps by hand in the margins. The handwriting was mine, decisive and narrow. I didn't know yet how much of a problem that would become. And the first document I saw rewrite itself was my own audit note, not on the screen, on paper. I had just finished comparing Duval's handover memo to the current station activity log when the printer in the alcove spun up behind me without a command. The sound made me turn. One page fed out halfway and stopped. I crossed the room smelling toner and that now familiar heated metal scent and saw the header before I touched it. Supplemental discrepancy notice. Below that was my personnel information, still misspelled in the same deliberate way as every earlier record. Beneath it, a summary field had been populated with language from my own note. Identity mismatch appears systematic across active local records. Then, while I watched, the next line changed. Most likely low-priority replication fault in decommissioned personnel schema. And the word low priority blurred first, ink shifting like it had gone wet again under the toner gloss. The letters puckered, separated, and resettled into a new phrase. Initial correction resistance detected. I didn't move. My hand was 6 inches from the page. I know that because I remember the exact texture of the counter edge pressing into my thigh while I leaned in, and the way the warm paper stirred the air against my knuckles. No action required pending full archive extraction. That line went next. The sentence thinned, dropped 2 words, then rebuilt itself in my own clipped reporting cadence. Reclassification in progress pending subject cooperation. The hum under the floor strengthened until the metal trim at the base of the cabinets trembled. I stepped back. Not because I believed the wall rule. Not fully, and because there are moments when your body makes the correct decision before your mind catches up. Mine finally had. The page finished printing. At the bottom, where a signature block should have been blank, my name appeared in ink that looked half-typed and half-penned. Not Grant Hollis Wainwright. Not even the wrong system version, a third version. Closer to a guess than either of the others. And the signature beneath it had my pressure, my slant, the hard downward drag on the last stroke that came from an old tendon pull in my wrist. I hadn't touched the page. I went cold all the way through, not a startle, a draining, like my body had decided blood was needed elsewhere and pulled it back from the skin. On the second page, the printer had produced. One line sat alone in the center. Discrepancy identified. Correction in progress. And the same line from the hallway document I would see later, in another context, as if the station had only a handful of official phrases and meant to make all of them mine. I lifted the page with 2 fingers by the corner. It was warm and dry. The ink didn't smear. There was no trick to it that I could force into a mechanical category. No hidden feed, no reactive paper, no obvious thermal overwrite system installed in the printer bay. I pulled the machine tray, checked the toner cartridge, ran a manual diagnostic. The printer reported nominal. Of course it did. I spread my paper chain across the operations desk and started comparing copies. At some point, professionalism becomes a reflex so deep it survives even while the rest of you is failing. If a record changed, I wanted a before and after. If a phrase repeated, I wanted source frequency. If my signature appeared where it shouldn't, I needed to know whether the shape matched a true sample or a generated approximation. That was when I found the older report fragment. It had been tucked behind Duvall's memo in a mixed station binder, probably included by accident years before when corporate consolidated northern facilities under one archival package. The header belonged to Sable Ridge, the tower site, my report, preliminary structural summary revision 1, not the version on file, the version before I altered it. The wording was plain, ugly even. Observed fracture propagation exceeds expected winter tolerance. Suspend operation pending structural review. Personnel presence not advised under forecasted lateral load. I had forgotten the original sequence, or maybe I'd made myself forget it. Then clipped behind it there was the filed version I knew too well. Observed fracture propagation remained within expected winter tolerance. Continued operation authorized pending seasonal reinforcement. No immediate risk to personnel under forecasted lateral load. I sat there with both pages under my hands and listened to the station breathe. That was the first time I let myself think Owen's name without building the usual wall around it. He'd filed the base anchor notes because the tower was walking under gust load. I had changed the language because a shutdown would have frozen the whole monitoring program, triggered a budget review, and pulled attention toward the fact that I'd already signed earlier certifications based on incomplete structural data. If the tower went down for inspection, my previous approvals would have been examined, maybe not ruined, maybe not publicly, but enough to stop the promotion already moving under my feet, enough to change the story of who I was inside the company. So I changed the story first, not everything. That's the poison of it. I didn't forge measurements out of nothing. I shaved tolerances, shifted emphasis, moved risk down a line just like Owen's voice had said. I turned urgent language into manageable language and trusted weather to buy me time. It bought me 6 days. The station printer clicked again behind me. I didn't turn immediately. I knew, with a certainty I can still feel in my back teeth, that if I looked I would find another page with my handwriting on it. When I did turn, I was right. The new sheet wasn't a personnel notice this time, and it was an addendum to an internal station maintenance form, authorizing archival voice interface review under supervisory discretion. Signed by me. I had never seen that document in my life. At the bottom, under remarks, one line had been added in narrow black type. Do you remember what you changed? I folded the page without reading it twice and put it under the oldest copy of Duval's memo, like paper could shield paper from whatever this was. Then I heard footsteps in the hall. Not over speakers, not through ducting. Real footsteps, soft on the vinyl corridor, measured and unhurried. I called out before I could stop myself. Maribel! The steps stopped. That was my first spoken mistake. By the time I reached the hallway, she was already there. He's standing under the dim strip lights with a clipboard held against her chest and a look on her face that suggested we'd interrupted each other in the middle of different conversations. The first thing I noticed was the frost on her jacket cuffs. Not heavy. Just a fine white seam as if she'd come in from outside, though I hadn't heard the exterior doors cycle and no one in their right mind would have been moving between modules without calling it. The second thing I noticed was that she wasn't surprised to see me. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. Maribel Quintero was shorter than I'd pictured from the personnel file, solidly built, dark hair pulled back in a knot that had partly worked loose. She carried a field notebook clipped with carbon sheets and a mechanical pencil tucked behind one ear. Her face had the flat composure of someone too tired to spend energy on politeness. You're later than I thought, she said. I almost answered the way people do in ordinary places with a joke or a correction. Instead, I asked, We've already talked. She looked at me for a second too long. On comms. Did we? My pulse kicked once, hard. Yes, I said, from the East Utility Wing. She shifted the clipboard in her hands and glanced past me toward operations. I was there earlier. The way she said earlier made the word useless. The corridor hummed around us. Air moved through the ceiling vents in a dry, steady stream that made the skin inside my nose sting. You told me not to trust updated records, I said. You said the station rewrites data to preserve internal consistency. Her expression changed, but only slightly. Not surprise. Recognition maybe of a script reaching her from the wrong direction. That's true, she said. Did it already start with your name? The question landed wrong. She'd already asked me that, or someone with her voice had. Which version of you did they send? She asked. There it was, the line that should have sounded ridiculous and didn't. I took a step closer. Maribel, have we had this conversation before? We have a lot of conversations before we have them here. I wish I could say I challenged that cleanly. I didn't. My mind was busy trying to sort tone from meaning. She didn't sound deranged. That was the problem. She sounded practical, irritated even, as if the burden of making sense of this had fallen to her too many times already. She held out the clipboard. On the top page, in uniform station font above a maintenance schematic, one line had been typed across the header. Primary source of discrepancy. Under that, my wrong name. The page listed cross-references to active archives, personnel files, and revised structural summaries from other stations. Sable Ridge was there. So was this post. So were 2 additional sites I'd certified years ago. My mouth went dry for reasons that had nothing to do with the air. "This isn't official," I said. Maribel gave me a look I couldn't read. "It is here." I reached for the page, then stopped. The wall rule about updating records was suddenly very present in my mind. "Where did you get this?" "I printed it before it printed itself somewhere else." That sounded almost like humor. Almost. Behind her, on the corridor wall panel opposite us, a maintenance notice strip was still blank. And I know it was blank because I looked at it while I was deciding whether to take the clipboard. Maribel lowered her eyes to the page in her hands and started reading in a steady voice. "Observed conflict between subject memory and station continuity. Correction pathway requires source admission or full environmental rewrite." I felt the skin tighten at the base of my neck. "Stop." She didn't. "If source remains non-cooperative, surrounding records will be adjusted until discrepancy resolves by consensus." I turned to the blank wall behind her as the first letters appeared there under the clear panel. Black type resolving line by line in the same words she was reading out loud. My legs actually weakened, not much, enough that I had to shift my weight to keep from showing it. When Maribel looked up, there was no triumph in her face. "I know, I told you so." Just a worn kind of pity. "You see why I didn't want to meet in person," she said. The line on the wall finished writing itself. For a few seconds, none of us moved. Then, from somewhere deeper in the station, an intercom popped alive with a burst of static, and I heard my own voice say, "All personnel report discrepancies immediately." Not an imitation, not a close synthetic copy. My voice. I had never recorded that sentence. Maribel flinched before I did, which unsettled me more than the sound itself. It meant she hadn't expected that version yet. She took one step backward. "It's using you faster now." "What are you?" She blinked at me, and for the first time her control broke just enough to show anger. "You're trying very hard not to become paperwork." Then she turned down the side corridor and was gone before I decided whether to follow. That was the last time I thought another person in that station could still anchor me to a shared reality. After that, every human contact arrived already contaminated by timing, by duplication, by the possibility that the version in front of me had been generated to fill a gap. I took the clipboard page. When I looked down at it in operations less than 3 minutes later, the header had changed. Primary source of discrepancy had become correction subject. Owen's voice began arriving through the station a little after that, and once it started in earnest, there was no room left for denial. At first, it stayed where a voice like that should have stayed, in archive terminals and speaker grills. Then it moved, and it came out of wall intercoms that hadn't worked on arrival. It murmured from the handheld recorder clipped to my own bag, though the battery indicator on that device was dead. Once, while I was bent over the operations desk comparing print chains, I heard him from inside the duct above me, not loud, just close. "Grant, what did you change in the final summary?" I kept writing timestamps by hand. The question came again, from the console speaker this time. "What did you change in subsection 4, structural risk assessment?" I didn't answer. My pulse was high, but my hands still moved. I made a new note in block capitals. "Archived voice interface now multi-point. Content targeted and responsive. The printer spat out a log almost immediately. Non-cooperative data node. I stared at that line until the words stopped behaving like words. And then Owen again, patient as a recorded training module. What did you change from suspend operation pending review? The room smelled so strongly of heated wiring that I thought for a second something had actually caught fire. I checked the breaker panel. No overloads, no melt, no smoke, just the smell and that dry processed air scraping my throat rawer with each breath. I didn't change the measurements, I said before I realized I had spoken. Silence followed. Then, very softly from the speaker above the whiteboard, you changed what they meant. I shut the intercom circuit at the panel. The voice shifted to the portable recorder on my desk. I stuffed the recorder into a drawer and slammed it shut. The voice moved to the drawer cavity, muffled but clear enough. What did you change, Grant? I wish I could tell this part in a way that makes me sound braver. The truth is I held out because naming the lie out loud would have made it final in a way even the collapse hadn't. Officially, the tower had failed in an extreme weather event. Officially, environmental conditions exceeded modeled response, and a junior technician died during a structural incident no one individual could have predicted. Officially, my prior certifications had been reasonable based on available data. Officially, I had walked away from it. Unofficially, Owen had sent up a clean field warning in plain language. The base anchor was walking under gust load. The support footings were taking strain outside the winter model. He wanted operations suspended. I saw the field note. I saw the raw vibration table from his instrument set. And I'd changed the summary language that reached the people who would have had to act. Because I was already tied to earlier stability approvals, because a shutdown would have exposed how thin those approvals had been. Because I wanted the promotion that came from being the man who kept difficult stations online through bad seasons. You can dress all of that in corporate logic if you want. I had, for years. The station didn't let me. Owen's voice began quoting the report back to me in fragments, alternating between what he'd filed and what I'd submitted. Suspend operation pending structural review. Continued operation authorized pending seasonal reinforcement. Personnel presence not advised under forecasted lateral load. No immediate risk to personnel under forecasted lateral load. His tone never changed. That was the worst part. No anger, no accusation, just comparison. A machine audit wearing a dead man's voice because the dead man had been attached to the original data set. When I still didn't answer, the station printed another status note. Subject maintains contradictory self-report. A second page followed. Environmental realignment may be required. That phrase shook me harder than anything Owen had said. Environmental realignment. If the station meant what Maribel had warned, then refusal didn't preserve me. It forced the surrounding record to bend until I fit it. That meant doors, logs, voice prints, maybe memory itself. A closed system had only so many places to put a contradiction. I walked the station after that with a flashlight in one hand and a stack of old copies under my arm, checking room by room for anything still stable. And the farther I got from operations, the less ordinary the discrepancies became. In one lab, a whiteboard inventory listed me as present on a date before I had arrived. In storage, my handwriting appeared on an equipment issue tag for a tool I'd never handled. In the emergency vestibule, the sign-out clipboard carried my initials on lines above and below entries from years I hadn't been on site. My handwriting, my slant, my pressure. Contamination was too mild a word for how it felt. It wasn't that the station was forging me. It was distributing me like ink through water. By the time I circled back to operations, my own voice was on the intercom every 10 or 15 minutes, issuing short procedural instructions in the stripped tone I used during inspections. All personnel verify identity at shift start. Do not alter any written record without authorization. Correction in progress. I hadn't said any of it, yet each time I heard it, some traitorous part of my mind registered the phrasing as mine and wanted to accept it on that basis alone. That is how administrative systems get into you, long before anything supernatural enters the room. They borrow the tone you trust. I found Maribel again because she let me, not because I tracked her. I was in the connector hall between utilities and archive, the long one with the sealed observation window looking out over nothing but floodlit snow, when she stepped through the far door carrying a stack of folded forms under one arm. The lights overhead were brighter than before, or maybe steadier, and the hum in the floor had risen to the point where I could feel it in my shins. She stopped when she saw me, but there was no recognition in her face this time. Not at first. "You shouldn't be here during overlap," she said. "We already did this." Her eyes flicked to the papers in my hand, then to the hallway clock above the far door. The clock showed the wrong minute. I knew it was wrong because my watch disagreed, but when I checked again 3 seconds later, my watch had shifted to match it. "We probably will," she said. Something in me almost laughed then, not from humor, but from the clean exhaustion of a mind running out of categories. "Maribel, listen to me. The station's using Owen's voice. It's printing corrections with my signature. It labeled me correction subject. Yes, you knew. I suspected." She tightened her grip on the forms. I didn't know whether it'd choose archive reconciliation or subject absorption. The phrase subject absorption hit me like a physical touch. What does that mean? It means sometimes it can't delete the bad record, so it integrates it until the network balances. She said it with the detachment of someone quoting procedure she hated. I stepped closer. "Are you real?" She didn't answer immediately. Then with a kind of bitter patience, she said, "I'm more real at some times than others." That wasn't helpful, and it also wasn't nonsense. That was the worst combination that station could produce. I asked where Duval was. She looked down the hall behind me as if checking whether someone else might be listening. The last version of him I trusted left notes in utility access and started hiding paper copies in vent housings. The next version told me to surrender my field notebook for normalization. After that, I stopped assuming continuity across encounters. "So there were different versions of you too." She gave me a thin, humorless smile. "That's why I asked which version of you they sent." Then she held out one of the folded forms. It was a station continuity review sheet, blank except for one typed line near the top. "Primary source of discrepancy, Grant Hollis Wainwright." This version of my name was spelled correctly. That frightened me more than the errors had. "If it's correcting me," I said, "why fix the name now?" "Because it has enough of you to stop guessing." The corridor air seemed to drive further around us. I could feel each swallow scrape. "Tell me what happens if I cooperate." Maribel's eyes went to the observation window. Beyond it, the snowfield reflected the station lights in a flat, hard sheen. Nothing moved outside, not even drift. "It stops fighting you," she said. "And if I don't, it stops fighting the room instead." I wanted to ask what that meant, but some part of me already knew. The wrong clock, the shifting watch, the duplicated signatures, a closed environment changing context until the contradiction no longer existed. Maribel looked past my shoulder and frowned. "You're not where I expected you to be." "I walked here from operations." "No," she said, "in the sequence." Before I could answer, she unfolded another sheet and started reading from it in that same steady voice I'd heard earlier. "The subject may attempt terminal destruction. Action classed as expected deviation and not grounds for process suspension." I stared at her. "Where did you get that?" She glanced down at the page. "From you. Eventually. Behind her on the corridor wall, new black letters began to appear under the clear paneling. Subject may attempt terminal destruction. My skin went cold. She kept reading. Correction requires integration, not removal. The wall wrote that too. When she looked up, there was something like apology in her face, or warning. I don't think I'm ahead of you by much anymore, she said. Then the intercom above us snapped on and my own voice said, Field Technician Quintero, report for synchronization. Maribel's jaw tightened. For the first time I saw fear touch her. Don't come after me if I answer anything you haven't asked yet, she said. The hall lights dimmed once, brightened. She stepped backward through the utility door and pulled it shut between us. The access window went opaque from the inside. I never got a clean answer about Maribel after that. Whether she was another victim resisting a looped echo generated by the station or a person half-integrated and using the little freedom left to misalign its timing, I still can't say. That's part of what remains open. She helped me. She warned me. She also delivered lines that hadn't been written yet, and every useful thing she told me arrived with a shadow attached. I was alone again after that, if alone is the word for a station where the walls had started using your voice. The breaking point came fast. My personnel file updated first. I found it in operations after a brief power dip, printed and centered on the desk like an appointment card. The roll field no longer read Inspector. It read Correction Subject. My access permissions had changed with it. Areas that were locked on arrival now open to my badge. Areas I'd been using freely no longer recognized my clearance unless I spoke aloud. The station had begun keying to me by voice print, only it wasn't waiting for me to speak. Every few minutes my voice went out over the intercom issuing procedure updates and movement instructions. Doors unlocked to commands I hadn't given. The archive room granted access after a sentence I never said. The maintenance console accepted a verbal authorization in my exact tone and opened restricted continuity logs while I was standing 20 feet away with my mouth shut. And that was escalation in a form I don't think people outside infrastructure work fully appreciate. A door that opens for a voice without the speaker present is not just eerie. It means control authority has detached from the body it belongs to. In a remote station that is close to losing legal existence, I tried to make a clean map of the changes, oldest copies left, newest right, handwritten annotations only on pages printed before the first active rewrite. But the contamination spread. My notes began showing up duplicated on sheets I hadn't marked. An equipment requisition I never saw arrived with my initials in the margin. A comm status printout used my shorthand for temporary faults, not exact, but near enough that I knew the source style had come from me. I caught myself once listening to an intercom instruction in my own voice and feeling the tiny reflex of obedience that comes from years in controlled facilities. That scared me more than Owen, because Owen forced memory. My own voice invited surrender. I went back to archive anyway. There are bad decisions you make from panic and bad decisions you make because you're still trying to solve the problem that should have existed instead of the one that does. This was the second kind. The archive terminal was already open to a continuity folder. My name appeared across dozens of linked records now, not just the old tower file. Stability certifications, regional maintenance approvals, variance waivers. The station had pulled a lattice of my paperwork history and marked conflict nodes where wording shifts, tolerance softening, or risk downgrades appeared. Not all of them had killed anyone. Most hadn't, but the pattern was there. My habit rendered as data behavior, move risk down a line. A note had been appended to the folder in plain system language. Subject demonstrates recurring priority inversion, preserving process continuity at expense of source integrity. That's what I had done at Sable Ridge. That's what I had built a career doing in smaller ways everywhere else. Preserve process continuity. Keep the station running. Keep the schedule intact. Keep the paperwork survivable. My recorder, still in my pocket though I no longer trusted it, clicked alive and played my own voice at low volume. Grant Hollis Wainwright, identity verified. Then after a short pause, the same voice again, flatter. Correction subject. Identity pending. I dropped the recorder onto the desk like it had burned me. The archive speaker came on with Owen's voice layered faintly behind my own. Not overlapping, harmonized almost. Do you admit the filed summary differed materially from the observed field report? That wasn't a ghost question. It was deposition language, audit language, the language of controlled confession. I left the archive room with my heart pounding hard enough to make the hallway edges pulse. The floor hum had become so constant by then that whenever I stopped moving, my body kept waiting for the vibration to cease and never got relief. My throat hurt. My eyes felt dry from filtered air and too little blinking. Operations looked worse on return, not damaged, aligned. That was somehow more disturbing. The loose papers I'd left spread across the desk had been stacked by size. Duplicate copies clipped together. Oldest versions separated from revised sets. The station had organized my evidence. Centered on top was a printed procedural sheet titled Acceptance Protocol. The language was almost kind. When source discrepancy cannot be eliminated, integration is recommended. Admission improves continuity stabilization. Resistance may result in progressive environmental rewrite until consensus is achieved. I read it 3 times. Then I carried it to the terminal room and took a fire axe from the emergency bracket by the door. The axe handle was cold and slightly tacky with old varnish. Real. Solid. I remember being grateful for the weight. The terminal core sat in a half rack behind a hinged access panel, old but serviceable. Here with enough local storage and routing authority to handle records, environmental controls, and archive indexing. Destroy the core, I thought, and at least the local engine stops. Maybe the rest of the station dies with it. Maybe the doors fail, the voices stop, the updates stop. Maybe I lose heat and comms and have to sit in survival gear waiting for air support. Better that than staying inside a system currently distributing my handwriting. I hit the panel hard enough to shear the latch. Plastic cracked. A board inside snapped loose. The intercom came alive before I swung again. Expected deviation, my own voice said calmly. I brought the axe down into the rack. Sparks flashed. The metallic smell surged so sharply I reeled from it. The floor hum didn't change. Owen's voice came from the torn terminal housing itself, close and intimate. Removal does not correct conflicting data. I hit it again. Shards of casing skittered across the floor. The monitor on the desk flickered, went black, and returned with a single line in the center. Integration required. I stood there breathing hard, axe in hand, and realized something that should have been obvious sooner. The station wasn't trying to kill me in any ordinary sense. It wasn't even trying to punish me. Punishment implies judgment. This felt colder than that. It was trying to normalize a discrepancy in its records, and because I had made myself into that discrepancy years earlier, my body and memory were simply the most efficient place left to do the work. That is the moral shape of what happened, and it is uglier than revenge. I sat on the floor after that because there was nowhere else left inside me to stand. And the broken terminal clicked and cooled. Warm dust floated in the air. I could smell scorched insulation under the usual dry metal scent, and beneath both the faint, clean odor of paper just out of a printer. Owen spoke again, not from one speaker now, but from several, quietly enough that I had to listen. Correction requires source admission. If I admitted what I'd done, really admitted it, then maybe the station stabilized. Maybe the wrong clock stopped changing. Maybe the documents stopped breeding new versions. Maybe Maribel, if she was still somewhere in that place as a real and not a generated echo, got a consistent world back. But admission wasn't the end offered to me. Integration was. The acceptance protocol had been plain about that. It couldn't delete errors, it absorbed them. And to cooperate meant yielding identity to the process that had already borrowed my voice and handwriting. I'd stopped being contradictory because I'd stopped being entirely separate. If I refused, I kept the last private ground I had left. And the station kept rewriting everything around me until there was no stable outside from which to measure truth at all. That's not a heroic choice. It's not even a fair one. It is the kind of choice closed systems create when the people inside them have spent years treating paperwork as more real than consequence. I thought about Owen on the tower recording a clean warning because he believed writing was for telling the truth to the people who needed it. I thought about the revision I filed. I thought about the promotion letter that arrived 2 months after his death. And about the way I let the official version harden around me because it was easier to live in than the other one. Then I thought about something Maribel had said. Sometimes it changes the record that's easier. At Sable Ridge, I had made Owen the easier place to put the fault. Environmental failure, unpredictable conditions, nobody's decision in particular. At the station, I was the easier place. I don't know if that means the system was just. I don't know if justice even belongs in the same sentence with a machine logic that uses the dead as interface tools. But I understood the symmetry, and once I understood it, resistance felt less like defiance than repetition. So I went back to operations. The desk lamp was on. I don't remember turning it on. Its light made the paper stacks look almost domestic, almost safe. And the hum in the floor had settled into a steady pulse. No louder now, more like my body had finally synchronized with it. A fresh form waited in the printer tray. Source admission record. I sat down. The chair vinyl was cracked at one seam and a little cold where the cushion had compressed. That detail matters to me because it was the last ordinary sensation I remember before the station's language started feeling natural in my mouth. The intercom stayed silent. Owen didn't prompt me. Neither did my own voice. I read the form once. Then I began speaking into the desk microphone. My name is Grant Hollis Wainwright. 5 years ago, I reviewed the structural summary for Sable Ridge Tower after field observations indicated instability.